All right, so we are going to be looking at the Ndop. Ndop is a portrait figure object that would belong to a king. And so this is going to be a commemorative sculpture, an object made to um, either commemorate or honor an event or just the king's rule, something that's going to be made as an object that represents power and authority. The king represented here, I just call him King Mishi because I don't know how to say his whole name. So King Mishi. And so for title, you'd want to know Ndop, King Mishi. This is from the Kuba people of the Congo. And the way you can remember Cuba is if you think about kind of the overall shape, it's almost like a cube. So that might help you remember Cuba. This is a very compact figure. And when we talked about Egyptian art, and we talked about funereal pieces and the importance of them with permanence, and how a closed form like this, where everything is close together, a closed form, right, is going to be more likely to last than an open form, where you're going to have the danger of things breaking off. And so that compactness of the body should tell you that this is made for posterity, this is made to last. For a wood object, to be in this condition, you know, it's been taken care of, it has been oiled and preserved. And so you can see the date on there, right? 1760s, 1780s. Remember, if you're seeing a wood object, it has to really be most likely 18th century or more recent. Just think about the material, think about what it's made out of and how long that's going to last in the elements. So King Mishi here is being celebrated. This is something that he or his direct attendants could be the patron of, or his family could be the patron of. And they here are creating what is an idealized portrait. Now, if you might be thinking idealized, you know, he has the proportions of an infant, right? I mean, how is this ideal? But for this point in time, remember that, and for this location in the world, the ideal form is going to vary based on the beauty standards and aesthetics of that time. And so for this point in time, this is an ideal form, right? So he was a good ruler. He was known as being someone who had accomplished many things. So this is a positive object. It's really important with context that you guys link this back to the importance of the oral tradition, the oral narrative tradition within Western African dichotomy. It's very, very important that you're thinking about the fact that these people groups are dependent upon certain members of society to be the keepers of their stories, right? And so they're going to be wanting to record history, right? But it's through that verbal tradition, and so the stories are passed down. What happens when you have an oral history like this is sometimes things get a little bit mixed up, right? I mean, you don't have it written down, or it's not recorded in the way we in the Western world might think. And so there can be some fluidity to that story. And that's part of it, right? That's part of their culture. And so think about that as contextually important here. Um, I like to think about this object as being a kind of a marker of a time in history. And so as these were made, they're commemorating different kings over time. And these kings could be these sculptures of these kings, right? Even after the king is dead and gone, right? This is a king, King Nishi was from the 1700s. So after he's gone, his essence, his spirit can still exist in this object. And this object can be used to tell of his accomplishments, of the things he's done later on. Okay. I think we've talked about the rest of this. Again, the Kuba people, this would be a power and authority object. Let's talk more about form. So, as I mentioned, Kuba, we're thinking like it's this kind of cubical form. So, think about it having these rounded corners. If you look at kind of the edges of his forehead, his shoulders, his elbows, it kind of fits within this rectangular form. Um, it has a very pronounced collarbone, which is very typical of the Ndop figures. They have the proportions of an infant. And so when we talked about the human body and human proportions, like Doryphorus, right, of the early classical Greek, we were talking about ideal proportions of that point in time based on reality, based on how the human body, the adult body actually is. And it wasn't until much later, right? It wasn't until the Renaissance that they figured out that baby proportions are different, right? That's why all the medieval babies look like shrunken down little people, because they are not based on the true proportions. So, for example, an adult, your head is about a 7.5 time, right? I'm sorry, your body's about 7.5 heads high, right? And that can be exaggerated for effect, like we saw in the Hellenistic Greek, or that can be shown as just reality, okay, like we saw with the classical. Well, a baby, an infant's proportion, when an infant's born, their head is about a third of their body. And so as we look at the Ndop figures, we start to see that kind of infant proportions put on them. And this is a cultural standard. This is a decision they are making that is intentional, right? And so if realism is not your goal, if it's not if your goal is not an exact portrait, then you're able to abstract as needed to fit the cultural aesthetic, right? What people desire. All right, and of course, not a direct likeness, not created like looking at, King Mishi's face and trying to exactly replicate it. This is going to be an ideal form, not exactly him. He represents an ideal king. I talked to you guys about the 1:3 proportion or ratio there. The one interpretation is the reason the head is so large is because it represents intelligence, which is an ideal. Also, your head, your skull, this is going to be the part that most people associate with you, with an individual. And so we see that here as definitely most prominent. Notice the closed eyes. We kind of get that sense that he's transcending. Could be that he's timeless. Okay, you could talk about symmetry with this work. Notable is the board on his head. This was a part of a kind of a base for a crown, and we'll look at that as well in the photograph. The object sitting in front of him is like a little drum, and the drum has an emblem on it, and that emblem is a hand, a severed hand. And that is his identifier of his name. That's how we know that this is King Mishi. This is his emblem. Okay. And so it has that kind of specificity to it. And then his legs are crossed, right? Sitting with kind of crossed leg. And again, very, very closed forms. His arms are wedded to his body. He's a very closed form. There's his eyeball, right? His emblem of his severed hand here. So again, this is just his identifier. It doesn't mean that, he cuts people's hands off, okay? It's his identifier. All right, so purpose, function. As I mentioned, this is a part of their oral tradition. It's to help them keep kind of a collection of who their kings were and keep that tradition alive. It also is going to help show order of kings, and so these Ndops can be arranged to show ancestral order. We talked about posterity, the fact that this will be made to remember him and his deeds, and then College Board gives us a context picture. And remember, anytime College Board gives us a context picture, they could show you guys this picture and want you to know that it's about the Ndop. So they're giving you more information with these contextual images. And so here is an Ndop. I believe it's from the 1970s. So we're talking centuries after King Mishi. This is not King Mishi, this is another king. But you can kind of see the similarity in his stance, how he's seated. He's got his arms close to his body, right? Um, he has his full regalia of being a king on. And so he has raffia, shells, leopard skin, woven beads, all of this very, very close and tight and heavy. Think about how heavy all of this would be to wear. And so he is seated then because it would have been very, very difficult to walk in his full regalia and costume. And then this crown that he has on top of his head, this kind of sits on that board that he was wearing in the Ndop. Okay. So again, this is a tradition in terms of costume that has carried on since for many centuries. And then the royal drum, the royal drum is what the eyeball would be on. So again, remember the eyeball is that emblem that represents who is who.